Imagine the world's first internet. No fiber optic cables, no satellites, no Mark Zuckerberg desperately trying to stay relevant. Just camels, merchants, bandits, emperors, and a 7,000-mile thread of dust connecting the known world. That was the Silk Road. And calling it just a trade route is like calling the moon landing a short trip. Technically accurate, criminally underselling it. For over 1,000 years, roughly from 130 BCE to the 1450s CE, this vast network of routes linked China in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, threading through Persia, Central Asia, India, and Arabia. It carried silk, yes, but it also carried spices, glassware, gold, horses, religion, disease, diplomacy, and more revolutionary ideas per camel than a Silicon Valley conference. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it moved the entire trajectory of human civilization. And it did it quietly, through deserts and mountain passes, while empires rose and fell around it like distracted middle managers. It starts as so many great things do with a government official, a terrible assignment, and horses. Around 130 BCE, the Han Emperor Wu of China sent an envoy named Zhang Qian on what was essentially a diplomatic suicide mission. Go west, find allies against the Xiongnu nomads who kept raiding China's borders. Zhang Qian set off with 100 men. He was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately. He was held for 10 years. Classic. Upon finally escaping, rather than calling it a day and going home for some well-earned soup, Zhang Qian continued west, reached the kingdoms of Central Asia, Bactria, Fergana. Parthia took notes like an obsessed travel blogger, and eventually made it back to China 13 years after he left, with 2 surviving companions and a notebook full of intelligence that would change the world. What he found in the West blew the Han court's collective mind. Sophisticated civilizations, rich markets, and most crucially, for Emperor Wu, the famed heavenly horses of Fergana. These were larger, stronger horses than anything China had, bred in the fertile valleys of modern-day Uzbekistan. Emperor Wu wanted them so badly, he launched multiple military campaigns just to get them. Yes, the Silk Road was partially ignited by one emperor's obsession with horses. Some things never change men and their horsepower. Zhang Qian's reports catalyzed official Chinese diplomatic outreach across Central Asia, and by the time those first embassies set off carrying bolts of silk as gifts, a trade corridor was born. China had silk, a fabric so fine, so impossibly beautiful, that the Romans literally thought it grew on trees in the east. They called China Serica, the land of silk. The Chinese, wisely, kept the secret of silkworm cultivation classified for centuries. Silk was their iPhone, coveted, mysterious, and protected by something resembling a terms of service agreement that carried the death penalty. Here's the first thing to understand. The Silk Road was not a road. It had no lane markings, no rest stops, no helpful signs saying, Samarkand 200 miles, watch for bandits. It was a shifting, branching, overlapping network of routes across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, the Taklamakan Desert, whose name in Uyghur roughly translates to, you go in, you don't come out, the Pamir Mountains cheerfully nicknamed the roof of the world, and the vast steppes of Central Asia, where the wind was a full-time antagonist. Merchants rarely traveled the entire length. Instead, goods passed hand to hand, city to city, like the world's most consequential relay race. A bolt of Chinese silk might be bought and sold a dozen times before it became a Roman senator's toga. The great oasis cities were the lifeblood of this system. Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Merv, glittering stops where caravans rested, traders haggled, and culture collided in spectacular, sometimes explosive ways. Samarkand, in modern Uzbekistan, was perhaps the crown jewel, a city so wealthy and cosmopolitan that Alexander the Great, upon conquering it in 329 BCE, reportedly said, Everything I have heard about Samarkand is true, except that it is even more beautiful than I imagined. A rare 5-star review in an era without Yelp. These cities were not just pit stops. They were melting pots, places where Buddhist monks sat next to Zoroastrian firekeepers, where Chinese papermakers shared techniques with Arab mathematicians, where a merchant from Sogdia might trade Chinese porcelain for Roman glass over a cup of something fermented and locally questionable. The Silk Road was, in every meaningful sense, the world's first multicultural hub. Globalization, but with better hats. Yes, silk. Enormous quantities of silk, so much that at certain points, China was essentially running a luxury fabric empire that kept half the ancient world's elites clothed in quiet splendor. But the real story is everything else. From China went silk, porcelain, tea, paper, gunpowder, and cast iron. From the West came glassware, gold, silver, wool, linen, ivory, and exotic animals, lions, ostriches, and peacocks showing up in Chinese imperial courts like confused celebrities at the wrong awards show. From India came spices, cotton, and precious stones. From Arabia came frankincense, myrrh, and horses. From Central Asia came the Fergana horses, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, that vivid blue pigment that you see in medieval European paintings, which traveled west along the Silk Road centuries before any European artist touched a brush to it. Spices deserve special mention because the spice trade was, by modern standards, completely unhinged. Black pepper from southern India was so valuable in medieval Europe that it was used to pay rent, ransom hostages, and as a literal currency. When Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome in 410 CE, part of his ransom demand was 3,000 pounds of pepper, not gold, pepper. The man knew what he wanted. Historians estimate that by the height of the Roman Empire, Rome's trade deficit with the East, mostly for luxuries like silk and spices, was hemorrhaging perhaps 100 million sesterces a year out of the Roman economy. The Roman Senate complained about this constantly, passing sumptuary laws trying to ban the import of silk because too many Roman men were wearing it, and according to outraged senators, looking too comfortable. A problem humanity has grappled with ever since. Here is where the Silk Road gets truly world-altering, because the most consequential things it carried had no weight at all. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, largely along the Silk Road. The cave temples of Dunhuang, the Mogao Caves, stand today as testament to this. A series of nearly 500 painted grottos carved into the desert cliffs over 1,000 years by Buddhist pilgrims, monks, and patrons, their walls covered in some of the most extraordinary art of the ancient world. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, whose epic journey to India in the 7th century CE to collect Buddhist scriptures inspired the classic novel Journey to the West, traveled extensively along the Silk Road routes. He was, effectively, history's greatest travel influencer, except instead of promoting a resort in Bali, he was literally on a mission from God. Islam, following its rise in the 7th century, spread with stunning speed across the Silk Road network. Arab and Persian merchants carried not just goods, but faith, language, and science. The so-called Islamic Golden Age, that extraordinary flourishing of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy between the 8th and 13th centuries, was in part powered by the intellectual cross-pollination of the Silk Road. Algebra, from the Arabic al-jabar, reached Europe through translations made possible by this connected world. The numerals you're using right now, 1, 2, 3, are Arabic numerals that traveled from India to the Arab world and then to Europe along these routes. The next time someone can't do math, you may historically blame the Silk Road for making it so accessible. And then there was the dark side. The Silk Road was also history's greatest disease highway. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century CE, which killed perhaps a quarter of the Eastern Roman Empire's population, traveled west via the Silk Road. The Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century, almost certainly traveled from Central Asia to Europe along the same routes. The very connectedness that made the Silk Road civilization's greatest engine of progress also made it civilization's most efficient pathogen delivery system. The ancient world's version of going viral, and just as hard to stop. The Silk Road never had a single owner. It thrived under the protection, taxation, and occasionally the violent hospitality of a succession of great empires. The Parthians of Persia controlled the crucial middle section for centuries and grew fabulously wealthy, acting as middlemen between China and Rome, a position they jealously guarded, ensuring that Rome and China rarely traded directly. Rome and China knew each other vaguely, like two people who've heard of each other through mutual friends, but never actually met. Roman sources referred to China as Ceres, and Chinese chronicles mention a place called Dakin, almost certainly Rome, describing it as a rich land far to the west that also had silk, which confused the Chinese enormously because they knew perfectly well they had all the silk. The Sogdians, a people from modern-day Uzbekistan, largely forgotten by popular history, were perhaps the Silk Road's greatest unsung heroes. Ethnically Iranian, supremely commercially talented, and seemingly everywhere at once, Sogdian merchant communities set up trading posts from China to Byzantium, writing letters home in a cursive script that would eventually evolve into the Mongolian alphabet, conducting business with a sophistication and geographic reach that would have impressed a modern logistics company. Sogdian letters, found in a Chinese watchtower dating from around 313 CE, are among the earliest surviving merchant correspondence in history, and they read with a directness and humanity that feels startlingly modern. Complaints about slow payments, bad debts, the difficulties of long-distance business. Some things are eternal. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and his successors, then pulled off the single greatest transformation of the Silk Road in its history. By the 13th century, the Mongols had conquered most of Asia and swaths of Eastern Europe, creating an empire so vast that for a brief, violent, extraordinary century, a period historians call the Pax Mongolica, a traveler could theoretically journey from China to Hungary under a single political authority. The Mongols were brutal conquerors who killed millions, but they were also pragmatic rulers who understood that trade meant tax revenue, and tax revenue meant empire. They maintained roads, established relay stations, issued passports, and policed the routes with a ferocity that made long-distance travel safer than it had been in centuries. Marcopolo made his famous journey to China under Mongol protection in the 1270s, returning with stories so extraordinary that people called his memoir the Book of Marvels and accused him of making it all up. He probably exaggerated, but he was also probably fundamentally correct. The Silk Road's decline was a slow unraveling, not a sudden end, and it came from multiple directions at once. The collapse of the Mongol Empire in the late 14th century fragmented its overland protection. The Black Death, carried precisely along these routes, devastated populations and disrupted trade across Eurasia. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century disrupted traditional overland routes, increasing costs for European traders who were already deeply frustrated with paying middleman premiums they could not control. And so, with that peculiarly human combination of desperation and ambition, European sailors went looking for another way. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and reached India by sea. Columbus, looking for the same thing in the wrong direction, bumped into an entirely unexpected continent in 1492. The age of exploration was, in no small part, the Silk Road's legacy, a world so deeply aware of the wealth that lay in the East that it spent decades and fortunes trying to find a cheaper path there. The overland routes didn't die overnight. They persisted in reduced form for centuries, but the gravitational center of global trade shifted from the caravan to the sailing ship, and the great oasis cities of Central Asia gradually faded from the main stage of history. The Silk Road lasted in various forms for roughly 1,500 years. To put that in perspective, it is older than Islam, older than the Viking Age, older than the concept of Europe as we understand it. In that time, it transferred not just goods, but the fundamental building blocks of the modern world: paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, Buddhism, Islam. The mathematical concepts underlying science, the pandemic that reshaped European society and arguably accelerated the Renaissance, and the insatiable appetite for Eastern goods that drove Europe's age of exploration and, ultimately, the globalized world we inhabit today. Every time you use paper, navigate by compass, apply algebra, or order something that ships from the other side of the planet, you are living in a world shaped by a network of dusty caravan trails and ambitious merchants who crossed the most hostile terrain on Earth for profit, curiosity, and occasionally excellent pepper. The Silk Road was not just ancient history's greatest trade network. It was the prototype for everything that came after an early, audacious proof that the world, for all its distances and differences, has always wanted to be connected. It just took a few thousand camels, a remarkable number of bandits, and 7,000 miles of determined human ambition to prove it. Some things, it turns out, are worth the journey.